I need both of your IDs, right now.
Are we being detained? What crime are you investigating?
A report came in. Just give me your IDs.
A report of what exactly? And what law says we have to identify without reasonable
You're making
suspicion?
this difficult. Don't play games.
We're not playing games. We're asking if this is...
This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. A patrol officer named Suarez stood at the edge of a breakfast booth, shoulders squared like he'd already decided what kind of day this was going to be. Two men sat with plates half finished, napkins pushed aside, and a small spread of papers and markers between them. The men stayed seated, calm, still eating, still refusing to give up control of the moment. Suarez kept pressing for identification. He framed it like a simple request, but he repeated it like a command. The men didn't match his energy, they didn't raise their voices, they didn't reach for pockets, they didn't scramble to prove innocence. They did the opposite. They asked again and again what crime they were suspected of and whether they were being detained. Suarez didn't answer those questions in a way that cleared anything up. He kept circling back to the same idea. If nothing was wrong, showing ID would make it easy. The men didn't take the bait. They kept pushing the legal line back into the center of the conversation. No crime, no reasonable suspicion, no detention, no ID. And around them, the restaurant went quiet in that specific way it did when strangers decided they were watching a situation instead of eating breakfast. Now, before this goes any further, tell everyone where you're watching from. Country, state, city, anything. And if you watch stories about power getting checked by facts, boundaries, and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because what happened next wasn't luck. It was the kind of thing that only happens when someone stays calm, stays precise, and the right eyes show up at the right time. The two men at the booth were Malik Grant and Evan Cole. On the surface, they looked like two guys doing paperwork over breakfast. Hoodies, casual jackets, nothing flashy, no cop look, no visible gear. But they weren't civilians. They were undercover detectives running an operation, and the papers and markers weren't random. They were planning, tracking, timing. The kind of work that lived on notes, maps, schedules, and quick corrections written in bold colors, so nothing got missed. It was mid-morning at a family restaurant that catered to regulars. The atmosphere was predictable. Coffee refills, local gossip, plates sliding across counters, people who felt like they owned the space because they'd been there 100 times. Malik and Evan didn't fit in the way some people measured belonging. They weren't loud, they weren't causing a scene, but they were focused, working and talking about banks in a way that wasn't casual. That was all it took. A waitress named Tessa noticed them early. Not because they were disruptive, because they had papers spread out and they weren't talking softly. She overheard the word banks more than once. She saw a marker in someone's hand. She saw them pointing at something on the table. And instead of asking what they needed or treating it like normal business meeting behavior, she treated it like a threat. She didn't frame it as two customers doing paperwork. She framed it as fear. She reported that other customers were worried, that the men seemed like they were planning something. She used the words that would make someone respond fast. When the call reached patrol, it didn't come in as, "They're loud." It came in as suspicious talk about banks. It came in as the kind of vague warning that carried a lot of implication, but almost no facts. Suarez arrived ready to be the guy who stopped something before it happened. The problem was, he didn't walk in ready to observe. He walked in ready to confirm. He scanned the room and locked onto the booth. He didn't start by asking staff what they actually saw. He didn't separate rumor from detail. He went straight to Malik and Evan like they were already halfway guilty, and he just needed the paperwork to complete the story. He approached with the posture of authority that wasn't technically a detention yet, but was designed to feel like one. He positioned himself so Leaving would mean brushing past him. He stood close enough that the booth didn't feel private anymore. Malik looked up first, and he didn't move fast. He didn't act surprised. He acted like a man who'd spent years handling unpredictable moments without giving them extra oxygen. Evan stayed quiet at first, eyes on Suarez, reading him. Not emotional, not aggressive, just assessing. Suarez started with questions that sounded casual on paper. What were they working on? Why so many papers? What did they mean by banks? Who were they? Then the questions narrowed toward identity. Suarez asked for IDs. Malik didn't comply. He didn't refuse in a dramatic way. He refused in a controlled way. He asked what crime was being investigated. He asked what reasonable suspicions Suarez had. He asked whether they were being detained or free to go. That's where the power game started to show. Suarez didn't give a clear detention. He also didn't let it be a normal conversation. He tried to hold them in place without saying the words that would trigger legal standards. He tried to get what he wanted: names, information, control, without committing to an actual basis. Evan stepped in then, still calm, still seated, but more direct. He repeated the same questions Malik asked. What crime? What specific suspicious behavior? Were they detained? Suarez didn't answer cleanly. Instead, he pushed the familiar pressure line. If they weren't doing anything wrong, showing ID would be quick and easy. He treated their refusal like a sign of guilt. He treated compliance like the price of peace. Malik and Evan didn't argue feelings. They argued process. They pointed out that a waitress's vague fear wasn't a crime. They pointed out that talking about banks wasn't illegal. They pointed out that having papers and markers at a breakfast table didn't create reasonable suspicion. And then they did something that made Suarez visibly more irritated. They suggested he go talk to the waitress and get actual facts instead of fishing for IDs from two people who were just sitting there. That suggestion hit Suarez's ego because it exposed what he was doing. It wasn't investigation. It was leverage. The room had shifted by then. A couple people at nearby tables were watching too hard. Someone near the counter had their phone angled in a way that didn't look like texting. The restaurant's ceiling cameras were pointed down across the booths, silent and unblinking. Suarez kept standing there, and the longer he stayed, the more it looked like what it was: one officer trying to turn discomfort into authority. Malik and Evan held the line. No escalation, no sudden moves, no yelling, just consistent questions and consistent refusal. And that's the part most people don't understand until they see it. Staying calm doesn't end pressure. Sometimes it increases it because it removes the excuse to call you the problem. Suarez tried a new angle. He leaned into the social script, the one that's worked for him before. The script where the officer plays reasonable and the citizen plays difficult. The script where the crowd assumes the officer must have a reason. But Malik and Evan didn't give him the performance. They kept it clinical. They kept it simple. They kept it on the record. And then, right when Suarez seemed ready to either double down or manufacture something more, the front door opened and a new person walked in. This person didn't scan the room like a customer looking for a seat. He looked like someone who noticed everything. Someone who belonged in the building in a way Suarez hadn't considered. He took 2 steps in and looked towards the booth and recognized Malik and Evan instantly. That recognition was the tiny detail that changed everything. The man who walked in was Mason Hale. Plain clothes, no uniform, but he carried himself like someone who'd worn one for a long time. He paused just long enough to take in the posture at the booth. Suarez standing over 2 seated men, the table covered in notes, the whole room watching. Hale didn't ask the hostess for a table. He didn't pretend this was none of his business. He walked straight toward them. Suarez noticed him late because Suarez was still locked into his own pressure routine. But Malik saw Hale immediately. Evan did too. Neither man looked relieved. They looked ready for the next move, whichever way it went. Hale reached the booth and gave Malik a quick nod that said he knew exactly who he was. Then he looked at Evan the same way. Recognition, familiarity. Professional. Suarez's face changed before anyone said anything out loud. He didn't have to be told what it meant. He could see it. Two men he'd been treating like suspects were being acknowledged like colleagues. Hale asked Suarez what the situation was. Suarez tried to summarize it in the safest language possible. He kept it vague, like the original complaint. Customers were concerned, talk about banks, papers on the table. He was just checking. Hale didn't accept the summary as justification. He asked what specific crime was being investigated and what specific behavior created reasonable suspicion. He asked whether Suarez had detained them or whether this was consensual. That's when the whole thing tightened, because Malik and Evan had already asked those questions multiple times, and Suarez had avoided answering them. Now, the same questions were coming from someone Suarez couldn't dismiss. Suarez tried to pivot into the public safety explanation again, but Hale cut through it by forcing it back to standards, what facts, what suspicion, what legal basis. Malik finally ended the uncertainty without making it a show. He identified himself as a detective, still calm, still seated. Evan followed with the same. They did it the way experienced undercover guys did it. Short, controlled, not flashing anything around for the dining room. Hale confirmed it with his own reaction. He addressed them like detectives and asked briefly if they were good. In that moment, Suarez understood he had walked into a restaurant, trying to fish IDs from two people who knew the law better than he did and who could make the consequences real. The tone flipped so fast it was obvious to everyone watching. Suarez stepped back half a pace. His voice dropped. His posture softened. The same man who'd been leaning on, "If you're doing nothing wrong," now sounded like he was trying to rewind the last 5 minutes. Hale didn't let him. He told Suarez, clearly and without yelling, that a vague complaint about talking about banks and having papers wasn't reasonable suspicion. He pointed out that asking for ID without grounds was not a harmless habit. It was a constitutional problem and a community trust problem. He reminded Suarez that a consensual encounter stayed consensual only if people were actually free to refuse, and that hovering over a booth demanding ID looked like a detention, no matter how it was labeled. Hale also pointed out the mistake Suarez had made from the start. He hadn't even gone back to the source to separate what was actually observed from what was assumed. He had treated a nervous story as evidence. Malik didn't pile on. He didn't gloat. He kept his face neutral and his voice level. He told Suarez the same thing he'd been saying all along. If there was no crime and no suspicion, there was no reason to demand identification. He kept it simple. He made it about the rule, not about Suarez as a person. Evan added one more point, still measured. Suarez's favorite line, "If you're doing nothing wrong," wasn't a legal standard. It was a pressure tactic. And it didn't become valid just because a badge said it. Suarez tried to recover by saying he was just following up because people were worried. Hale didn't argue that people could feel worried. He argued what police could do with worry. He drew the line between feelings and facts. And then Hale made it practical. He told Suarez that his body camera would show the entire exchange, including the repeated refusal to articulate suspicion, and that supervisors would not defend ID phishing if it became a complaint. That part mattered, because now it wasn't just Malik and Evan holding a boundary. It was oversight, documentation, a clear record, the thing that turned a street-level power play into a professional liability. Suarez finally backed off. He told Malik and Evan he hadn't known who they were. He apologized, but it wasn't the kind of apology that fixes what just happened. It was the kind of apology people give when they realize they pushed the wrong target. Hale didn't let Suarez leave without one final correction. He told him, quietly but firm, that the job wasn't to turn stereotypes into stops. The job was to observe, verify, and only escalate when facts supported it. Suarez nodded like he understood. Then he turned away from the booth and walked out. The restaurant noise came back in small pieces. Silverware, low voices, coffee being poured. like everyone had been holding their breath and didn't realize it until it ended. Malik and Evan didn't celebrate. They didn't even look around to see who had been watching. They gathered their papers, stacked the markers, and kept their focus on what they'd come there to do. Because for them, that booth wasn't just a breakfast table. It was a reminder of how fast a normal morning could get dangerous when someone in authority decided a story sounded exciting enough to chase. In the hours after Suarez left, the moment didn't stay in that booth. The restaurant had ceiling cameras. Suarez had a body cam. And at least one customer had recorded a short clip showing the basic shape of it. An officer pressing two calm men for ID without clearly naming a crime, then shifting fast when a plainclothes supervisor arrived. By the end of the day, it was circulating locally. Some people defended Suarez as being cautious. Others pointed out that caution still had legal limits, and vague fear wasn't reasonable suspicion. Inside the department, Hale treated it like a policy problem, not internet drama. He pulled Suarez in and walked through the exact failures. He hadn't verified what the waitress actually observed. He couldn't articulate a specific crime, and he tried to turn a voluntary contact into compliance by leaning on pressure language instead of facts. Hale made one point stick. This wasn't only wrong because the men were detectives. It would have been wrong with any customers. The restaurant got contacted too. Management addressed the staff process for calling police because customers feel weird wasn't a reportable crime. The waitress admitted she hadn't heard a plan or seen anything illegal. She heard the word banks, saw papers and markers, and filled in the rest. She was given corrective guidance and a formal warning about escalating assumptions. Suarez didn't get a dramatic punishment. What he got was real-world accountability, a documented counseling entry, and mandatory refresher training focused on consensual encounters, detention standards, and ID requests. The kind of correction that follows an officer and becomes a bigger issue if it happens again. Malik and Evan didn't chase attention. They kept running their operation, and they made a practical change. They stopped using that restaurant for planning. Undercover work depended on staying ordinary, and the place had already shown it could turn ordinary into suspicious with one bad assumption. Weeks later, their paper and marker planning proved what it always was: actual police work. The patterns they'd mapped led to a clean stop tied to the activity they were tracking around financial locations. No headlines, just a solid case, the kind that protected people quietly. And that's where the full lesson landed. The most important thing wasn't that Suarez accidentally pressured undercover detectives. The important thing was how easily a vague complaint almost became a detention without legal grounds, and how fast the tone changed only when oversight entered the room. That's what accountability looks like in real life. Cameras, standards, supervisors who don't excuse shortcuts, and people who know how to calmly demand the legal basis before they give up their identity. So here's the question for you. If you were in that booth and an officer kept pushing for ID without naming a crime, would you have known what to ask, and would you have stayed calm enough to hold the line? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs the reminder. And subscribe if you want more story times where dignity and facts beat pressure.
Give me your identification.
What's this about? I'm just parked here waiting for my wife.
You look suspicious. That's all I need.
My phone is ringing. I'm gonna answer.
Make it quick.
This is Darnell Carter.
Yes.
Executive Director, Police Accountability Commission.
All right, listen. This is the kind of parking lot encounter that makes people say, that can't be real, until you remember how fast a normal day can turn into a controlled situation when someone with a badge decides they're in charge of the story. The officer had Darnell Carter boxed in so tight with the patrol SUV that Darnell couldn't back out even if he wanted to. The officer stood at the driver's side window, posture stiff, one hand hovering near his belt, and kept pressing for identification while treating the whole thing like Darnell had done something wrong just by sitting there. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from. What city and state? And if you watch these stories because you care about dignity, accountability, and people not getting pushed around just because someone has power, hit like and subscribe. Now, rewind. It was a normal day at a shopping plaza in Cedar Rapids. Late afternoon, busy parking lanes, people coming and going with bags, carts, kids. Darnell wasn't speeding through town. He wasn't causing a scene. He was parked. He was waiting on his wife, and he was doing what a lot of people do when they're killing time, reading through papers in the car, the kind of quiet moment that's supposed to be nothing. Engine off, seatbelt off, papers in his lap, phone nearby, no music blasting, no one yelling, just waiting. Darnell was black, mid-career, clean-cut, the kind of guy who stayed organized. He was used to being careful in public spaces, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he understood something a lot of people learn the hard way. The same harmless behavior can get read differently depending on who's doing it. He had been parked long enough to finish a few pages when he noticed the patrol vehicle. It didn't glide past like routine traffic. It slowed, it angled. It turned into the lane like it had picked him out. And then it did something that changed the whole situation. The patrol SUV pulled in behind Darnell's car, close, too close. Not a normal parking behind someone close, more like a deliberate block. Then, to make it worse, the officer angled the SUV in a way that left Darnell's front end boxed by another parked vehicle and his rear pinned by the patrol unit. That's not a casual contact. That's a detention move. Darnell sat still. He didn't start the car. He didn't reach around. He didn't jump out. He waited, hands visible, papers lowered. He watched the officer in the side mirror and the rear view, tracking every step. The officer approached with a certain energy, like the decision had already been made that something was wrong, and now the officer just needed Darnell to fit the story. The officer stood by the window and demanded identification. Darnell didn't argue right away. He asked what this was about, because he was literally sitting in a parked car in a public lot, waiting for his wife. He wanted to know the reason. The officer responded like reasons were optional. He claimed he didn't need one. He said Darnell looked suspicious. He talked in that vague way that can mean anything and nothing at the same time. Then it got worse. The officer used "people like you" language. Not a direct accusation of a specific crime. Not a clear concern like, someone reported a burglary or we're looking for a suspect. It was the kind of phrase that tries to sound like officer safety but lands as profiling. The kind of phrase that tells a person, without saying it outright, that the officer had already sorted them into a category. Darnell stayed measured. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't do the things some people expect. He didn't perform calm in a desperate way. He was just calm. He asked again what the suspicion was based on. The officer didn't answer with facts. He answered with control. He told Darnell to step out of the car. That command changed the stakes immediately, because it wasn't just about ID anymore. Now it was about compliance under pressure. Darnell took a breath. He moved slowly. He made it obvious he wasn't trying to surprise anyone. He told the officer he was reaching for his wallet because his ID was in it. That should have reduced tension. That's what people are told to do. Announce your movements, keep it visible, move slow. But the officer reacted like Darnell had done something aggressive. The officer's posture tightened. The officer's voice got sharper. The officer treated that reach toward the center console like it was a threat, like Darnell had reached for something else. And this is where the power chess starts showing. Because once an officer frames a normal movement as suspicious, the person on the other side is suddenly defending against an accusation that isn't based on anything real. Darnell had to manage his body, his tone, his hands, his wording, while the officer got to escalate on vibes. The officer ordered him to stop moving. Darnell froze exactly where he was, wallet still not even fully in hand. He made his hands visible again. He waited for instructions like his safety depended on it, because it did. The officer then had him step out and immediately put hands on him. Not a casual pat-down. A frisk. The officer ran through the motions like it was justified by suspicious behavior, even though the only behavior was sitting in a parked car and reaching for a wallet after being told to provide ID. Darnell didn't resist. He didn't argue during the frisk. He let it happen, because he knew how quickly a minor disagreement turns into a bigger story when the person with the badge decides it will. After the frisk, the officer took the ID and ran Darnell's information. And that's where this should have ended, because it came back clean. No warrants, no criminal history, nothing that matched the officer's implied narrative. In a normal world, the officer would hand the ID back, maybe give a short explanation and leave. But the officer didn't leave. Instead, the officer stayed right there, keeping Darnell standing outside his own car, continuing to question him like he was still trying to catch him in something. The questions weren't about a specific crime. They were fishing questions, the kind that keep a person trapped in a conversation where every answer can be twisted. Darnell answered without giving extra. He kept it short and clear. He was waiting for his wife, he was reading papers, and he wasn't doing anything illegal. The officer responded with dismissive comments, not overt slurs, not something that would be easy to summarize as one bad phrase, more like a constant drip of disrespect, tone, sarcasm, and the implication that Darnell's explanation wasn't good enough, even though it was completely normal. The detention stretched. People walked past. Some glanced. Some looked away fast. That's how these things often happen. Public enough for witnesses, but private enough that everyone feels like it's not their business. But at least one person noticed the pattern. A man being kept outside his vehicle, searched, cleared, and still treated like a problem. Darnell noticed that too. He saw the passersby. He saw the momentary eye contact. He didn't try to recruit help. He didn't wave anyone over. He stayed focused on one goal, getting out of this without giving the officer an excuse to escalate. Then his phone rang. And it wasn't just a random call. It was the kind of call that mattered enough that ignoring it felt risky. But answering it under this kind of scrutiny also carried risk, because now the officer could use it as another excuse to control the situation. Darnell looked at the officer, signaled what was happening, and made it clear he was about to answer. The officer hesitated, like he wanted to say no. And right there, right before Darnell hit accept, was the moment the entire stop balanced on a thin line. Because the next thing Darnell revealed would change the officer's tone so fast, it would feel like someone flipped a switch. Darnell's phone rang while he was still standing outside his car, still technically detained, still being treated like he owed the officer an explanation for existing in a parking lot. He didn't snap for his phone. He didn't rush. He kept his hands where the officer could see them and made a small, controlled motion to indicate what was happening. He made it clear he was about to answer a call. The officer didn't like it. His body language shifted like he was deciding whether to block it. He couldn't quite justify it out loud, though, because the situation was already thin. No crime, no warrants, no reason that held up. Darnell answered anyway, and he kept it brief. He identified himself the way people do when the call matters and time matters. Then he said the title that changed the temperature in the air. He explained he was the executive director of the city's Police Accountability Commission. The change in the officer was immediate. A second earlier, the officer had been dismissive, controlling, casual about authority. Now he became careful. His posture loosened just enough to signal he was backtracking without saying it. His voice dropped into a more professional register. He stopped using vague, suspicious framing and shifted toward procedural language. Darnell ended the call and looked at the officer again. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He didn't do the "do you know who I am" routine. He did something more effective. He went quiet and let the contrast speak for itself. Because the contrast was the proof. The officer had been comfortable treating him like a problem until it became clear Darnell had a role connected to oversight. Now the officer wanted to control the damage. The officer returned Darnell's ID. The officer started moving toward a soft exit, the kind officers use when they want an encounter to disappear. He acted like it had been a routine check. He acted like the delay had been normal. He tried to wrap it up as if the earlier language and the frisk and the fishing questions hadn't happened. But Darnell didn't let the officer rewrite what had just occurred. He stayed calm and precise. He asked again what the actual reason was for the stop and the frisk. He asked why he'd been boxed in. He asked why he'd been kept there after his record came back clean. The officer didn't give a real answer. He tried to keep it vague. He tried to suggest it was about suspicious behavior without naming any behavior that would hold up. Darnell kept his tone steady and didn't escalate. He just made it clear he was tracking every step. And while this exchange was happening, someone nearby was tracking it too. A witness, someone who had been walking toward the storefronts, had slowed down earlier when they saw the patrol SUV blocking the car. They noticed Darnell wasn't yelling. They noticed he wasn't acting reckless. They noticed he was being treated like a suspect anyway. The witness didn't intervene directly. They didn't try to argue with the officer. They did what people have learned to do in situations like this. They observed, they remembered details, and they prepared to report it. The officer, now aware the moment could have consequences, started rapping faster. He gave Darnell a final dismissive comment, lighter than before, but still meant to place the officer above accountability. The message was basically that Darnell should be grateful he was being checked, like the inconvenience and humiliation were normal costs of doing business. Darnell didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just said one line that ended the encounter cleanly. He stated that being cleared didn't justify being treated like a suspect in the first place, and that he would be following up formally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just made it clear this wasn't going to disappear. The officer walked back to his SUV and drove off. And just like that, the parking lot went back to normal on the surface. But Darnell didn't feel normal. His hands were steady, but his mind was already moving through the timeline like a checklist. The boxing in, the ID demand without reason, the people like you language, the escalation when he reached for his wallet, the frisk, the clean return, the extended detention anyway. Then the sudden tone shift after the title. Those details mattered because they revealed motive and pattern, not just one moment. A few minutes later, Darnell's wife, Maya, came out of a store with a small bag and the look of someone expecting a normal pickup. She saw his expression first. Then she saw the way he was standing, still in that controlled, post-incident posture people get when something has just happened and they're trying to keep it contained. Darnell told her quickly what happened, not with drama, with facts. Maya looked around the lot like she was trying to picture it. She asked where the officer went. She asked if Darnell was okay. She asked if anyone saw it. That's when Darnell pointed out the witness nearby, someone who had lingered longer than a casual shopper would. The witness approached just enough to make it clear they weren't imagining things. They told Darnell they saw the stop and felt it was wrong. They said they were willing to file a complaint and provide a statement about what they observed. The boxing in, the frisk, the length of detention, the way the officer spoke. That witness statement became the second key piece. Because in these situations, it's not just about what happened. It's about what can be verified. Darnell didn't waste time. That same day, he documented everything while it was fresh. Times, location, patrol car position, the sequence of commands, the fact he was cleared and still detained, the tone shift after he identified his role. Then he did something most people don't have the access or energy to do. He started the accountability process immediately. A complaint was filed. The witness filed one too. And that mattered because it forced the incident into a formal track. It wasn't a private grievance anymore. It was an official record with multiple points of contact connected to a stop that should have ended the moment the officers saw there was nothing there. That complaint triggered a body cam review. And the body cam didn't just capture an officer doing a stop. It captured the pattern, vague suspicion, aggressive control, and the way the officer treated Darnell before and after learning who he was. Once the review started, the city couldn't pretend it was nothing. Darnell didn't posture publicly. He didn't run to social media first. He followed the system the way it was supposed to work. Because if the system was legitimate, it should hold even when the person complaining was just a regular resident. But this time, the person complaining wasn't just a resident. He was also someone whose job existed, because the city claimed it believed in accountability. And that made the next phase unavoidable. Within days, conversations started happening behind closed doors. Not because the city suddenly cared about Darnell's comfort, but because the city could see what the footage showed, and they could see how the officer's language and choices would look under a review. Darnell then did the next step. He filed a civil rights lawsuit, not as a threat, as a documented response. He alleged the stop and detention were unconstitutional, rooted in profiling, and extended without lawful justification. The clean record made the extended detention harder to defend. The witness statement made it harder to dismiss. The body cam made it harder to spin. And then the story started to spread. Not because Darnell wanted it to be viral, because people in the community recognized the pattern immediately. They had their own versions of it. Different parking lots, different officers, different excuses. Same vague suspicious label. Same I don't need a reason attitude, same imbalance. And once the city realized this case wasn't staying quiet, they had a choice. Fight it and risk everything being exposed in court, or settle and try to control the fallout. They chose to settle, but settling didn't end it, because the officer's conduct wasn't just a misunderstanding. The review didn't stop at the lawsuit. It moved into employment decisions, policy questions, and oversight demands. And that's where the biggest shift happened. Because once the footage became public, the officer's behavior wasn't judged by internal culture anymore. It was judged by everyone. Once the complaint and the witness statement hit the system, the tone around the incident changed fast, because it was no longer just one person's word against an officer's. There was a time-stamped complaint. There was an independent witness, and there was body cam. The city initiated a formal review, and internally, that meant two tracks running at the same time, a legal track and a discipline track. On the legal side, the city's attorneys wanted to know one thing. Could they defend the officer's reason for boxing Darnell in and detaining him after the record check came back clean? On the discipline side, supervisors had to answer another question. Did the officer violate policy through the way he initiated the contact, escalated it, and prolonged it? Because from the outside, it looked simple. A man was parked, waiting for his wife, reading papers. The officer turned that into a stop without a clear reason, then kept it going even when there was nothing to support it. And that's the part people miss. The harm isn't only the frisk. It's the message that the person can be treated like a suspect without cause, and then held there until the officer decides to stop. The body cam footage became the center of everything. It showed the officer's initial approach and the setup. The patrol SUV placed behind Darnell's car in a way that trapped him. It showed the officer's repeated insistence on ID without explaining a specific complaint or alleged crime. It captured the suspicious framing without facts. And it captured the people like you phrasing that had no place in a professional stop. Most importantly, it captured the sequence that made it indefensible. Darnell did what the public is told to do. He moved slowly, announced he was reaching for his wallet, and kept his hands visible. The officer treated that as an escalation anyway. Then came the frisk. Then came the records check. Then came the clean return. And then, still no release. Instead of ending the encounter, The officer kept fishing. He kept Darnell outside the car, still under control, still being questioned, still being treated like an explanation wasn't enough. Then the call happened, and the footage caught the pivot. The moment Darnell identified his role as executive director of the Police Accountability Commission, the officer's demeanor changed. The officer didn't suddenly discover a new legal standard. He didn't suddenly remember policy. He just adjusted because the risk changed. That contrast wasn't subtle on video, and supervisors knew it. Attorneys knew it. Anyone who watched knew it. Darnell's lawsuit moved quickly because it was built on clear elements. The stop lacked a solid, articulable reason. The detention was prolonged after exculpatory information came back, and the officer's language suggested bias. The city tried the usual early moves, minimize, delay, and reframe it as routine. But there was a problem. Routine doesn't mean lawful. Routine doesn't mean acceptable. And routine definitely doesn't look like boxing a car in, frisking a compliant person, then dragging out questioning after a clean check. Behind the scenes, settlement discussions started earlier than most people would expect. Not because the city wanted to admit fault, because the city could see what discovery would do. Discovery would pull training records, prior complaints, internal messages, stop data and patterns. And once that door opens, it rarely stays contained to a single incident. So the city negotiated. The settlement wasn't framed as an apology on paper. Cities rarely do that. It was framed as resolution, risk management, closing the file. But there was still the employment decision. That part took longer because police discipline often moves slower and has more built-in resistance. Union processes, internal panels, appeals, and benefit of the doubt culture. Still, this case wasn't easy to protect. The footage wasn't a gray area. It showed the initial power move, the lack of clear justification, the escalation over a wallet reach, and the prolonged detention despite a clean check. It showed a tone shift linked to status, not safety. The department terminated the officer. The city didn't do it loudly at first. They did it through process. Termination notice, separation paperwork, a statement that stayed vague in public. But the story didn't stay quiet because the footage didn't stay private. Once public records requests and legal timelines moved forward, the video became accessible. And once it hit the internet, the public didn't watch it like an internal review board. They watched it like people who've seen this pattern before. The clip started spreading because it had the exact ingredients that make people stop scrolling. A calm black man in a parked car, an officer using authority without explanation, a stop that kept going for no reason, and then the immediate tone flip when the officer realized who he was dealing with. The virality wasn't about celebrity. It was about recognition. People shared it with captions that all sounded like the same point. This is what happens when the person doesn't have a title to protect them. Local reporters picked it up. Community meetings referenced it. People started calling in with similar stories. Some were recent, some were years old. But the pattern was consistent enough that it created pressure beyond Darnell's personal case. And pressure creates action, especially when it's tied to documentation. The policy conversation shifted from, "This was a misunderstanding," to "What safeguards failed here?" That's when the city was pushed into changes it had been slow walking for a long time. Mandatory body cams became less of a best practice and more of a hard requirement with enforcement. Not just wear it, but turn it on, with consequences for not recording. And the Police Accountability Commission's access changed too, because the core issue wasn't just having footage. It was who could see it, how fast, and whether it could be delayed until public attention died down. The city revised oversight access rules, so independent review couldn't be stalled behind internal gatekeeping. And none of that happened because the city woke up with new morals. It happened because one stop was documented clearly enough that it couldn't be explained away. In the middle of all that, Darnell stayed consistent. He didn't become a loud public figure. He didn't treat the settlement like a victory lap. He treated it like proof. The city resolved the case because they knew what the video showed. And in private, when the noise died down, there was still the personal aftermath. Because being right doesn't erase what it feels like to be treated like a threat in a parking lot, while people walk past pretending they don't see it. Darnell went back to his work with the commission knowing something he already suspected, but now he had the clearest example possible. The difference between how you're treated and how you're supposed to be treated can come down to one thing: whether the system thinks you can fight back. And that's exactly why the ending mattered. Because this didn't just end with a settlement and a termination, it ended with a policy shift that made it harder for the next ridiculous stop to stay invisible. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to use power to make you feel small, drop in the comments what you would have done in Darnell's place. And if you want more real, grounded stories about accountability and people standing firm without losing control, make sure you subscribe.
She grabbed my arm. I need you to do something right now before she deletes it and posts me online.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened, start to finish.
She rolled up with music, got disrespectful, called me racist, and then she grabbed me. I want this handled.
Stay right here with me. Don't walk toward her.
I'm telling you.
Separately.
Tell me what happened from your side and keep it simple.
He ordered me to turn my music off like he owned the place. Shouted racist phrases at me.
Did you touch him at any point? Grab his arm?
No, I didn't touch him. Not once.
She's lying. She grabbed my arm.
Do you have video of the interaction?
Yes, right here. I've been recording.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Janelle Carter kept her phone up at chest level, steady like she'd done it 100 times, while Chase Whitaker stood a few feet closer than he needed to, talking fast, louder than the music ever was. He was telling the responding officers that she had grabbed his arm and attacked him, and he wanted them to do something right now, before she deleted everything and posted him online. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, tell me where you're watching from, country or state, in the comments. And if you're into stories where cameras, receipts, and calm boundaries beat loud accusations, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It happened at a Love's gas station on August 29th, 2025. One of those bright, always busy travel stops where people come and go like background noise. Plenty of cameras, plenty of witnesses, and plenty of room for a small confrontation to turn into a police report. Janelle was known there, not famous, just familiar. Staff recognized her face, her car, the way she came in, grabbed what she needed, and left without drama. She wasn't the type employees had to watch, and that mattered later more than anyone realized at the start. Chase wasn't a regular to the staff in the same way. That didn't mean anything by itself, but it meant nobody at the store had a pre-built story about him. So when he started giving officers a confident version of events, the only thing backing it up was his voice. The call that brought police out was a battery complaint. Chase had reported that a woman had battered him. He described her outfit, purple, and her car, black Mercedes. He said she pulled up with loud music, cursed at him, called him racist, threatened to put him on social media, then grabbed his arm. He told dispatch he wanted officers to hurry. That hurry part wasn't accidental. Chase was trying to control the pace before anyone could slow the story down and test it. When officers arrived, he leaned into urgency. His body language said he wanted them to treat the situation like it was already decided. He kept circling back to the same points: loud music, disrespect, being called racist, and the arm grab. He framed it like he was minding his business and got attacked for it. Janelle's posture stayed different. She didn't perform panic. She didn't do the dramatic hands-up innocence act either. She gave what sounded like a timeline, not a speech. According to her, the music wasn't blasting. She said Chase had aggressively ordered her to turn it off, and it wasn't a request, it was a command. She said he followed her, staying in her space, and she started recording because she didn't trust what he might claim later. She denied touching him at all. And she said the first time he described it as her hitting or grabbing him was after officers were already on scene. That last detail is the kind of detail that can change everything. Because in a lot of parking lot calls, the first story officers hear becomes the default story. Whoever seems calmer gets believed. Whoever sounds most certain gets believed. Whoever uses the right keywords gets believed. But Officer Luis Ramirez and Officer Shannon Price didn't lock onto Chase's certainty. They did something simple that a lot of people don't expect in the middle of a messy accusation. They looked for proof. Janelle already had her phone video. She didn't act like it was a weapon. She treated it like a seatbelt, something you hope you never need, but you're glad you put it on. While one officer kept both parties separated, the other watched the clip, and the video didn't match the claim. On the recording, Chase was seen making the accusation that Janelle had grabbed him, while Janelle was clearly not within arm's reach. Officers estimated she was about 10 feet away when he said it. Not 2 feet. Not close enough for a quick grab. 10 feet. That doesn't just poke a hole in a story. It changes what the story is. Now, the incident wasn't simply a dispute about music. It wasn't even just a disagreement about who was rude first. It became a question of whether Chase had called 911 and accused someone of battery without it happening. And while the officers were processing that, the store employees started adding context. Devin Pike, one of the employees working that shift, told officers Janelle was a regular and didn't cause problems. Another staff member backed it up. Then the shift manager, Tina Alvarez, got involved and told officers she could call a manager to access surveillance footage because there were cameras pointed at the pumps and a good chance the area was covered. That offer mattered. It signaled that the store wasn't afraid of what the cameras would show. It signaled confidence. Chase, meanwhile, didn't have any footage. He didn't have a witness stepping up for him. He had his claim. And then he admitted something that officers often listen for. He had no video proof of her grabbing his arm. In a world where everybody's phone is always out, that's not automatically a lie. Plenty of real incidents don't get recorded, but here, the person he was accusing did have a recording, and it contradicted him in a clean, measurable way. Distance. This is where the power chess part shows up. Chase had tried to use the system as leverage. He used key phrases that make police move fast. Battery, aggressor, hurry, threat to post online. He pushed the idea that he was being targeted and harassed. But Janelle's move wasn't louder. It was cleaner. Recurred first. Speak second. Keep space. Let the facts carry the weight. The officers didn't rush to make her prove she didn't do it. They did what they were supposed to do. Compare statements to evidence. And once the evidence didn't match Chase's allegation, the direction of the call flipped. Instead of treating Janelle like a suspect, officers started treating Chase's report like the potential offense. He wasn't just mistaken. The accusation was specific. He said she grabbed his arm. He called 911 for it. He wanted immediate action. Yet the only video in play showed him making the claim while she was too far away to have done what he said. That's not a gray area, that's math. At that point, officers detained Chase. His tone shifted, less certainty, more frustration. The officers stayed procedural. They weren't debating him, they were documenting. He was arrested for making a false report. On top of that, he was cited for disorderly conduct and obstruction, based on how he acted during the investigation and response. Janelle wasn't celebrated. She wasn't treated like a hero. She was treated like what she was. The person who didn't lie, didn't escalate, and had receipts. Before officers cleared the scene, they gave her contact information and asked her to send any additional videos she had for the case. That detail is important too. It showed they were building the report around evidence, not around whoever shouted first. And just like that, a moment that could have gone sideways at a gas station ended with the person who made the accusation being the one put in cuffs. As soon as Chase Whitaker realized the call wasn't going the way he expected, his whole strategy changed. A minute earlier, he'd been pushing urgency, trying to make the officers treat his story like it was already proven. But the second officer, Luis Ramirez, pointed out the distance issue on Janelle Carter's video. Chase stopped acting like the victim of a battery and started acting like someone trying to talk his way out of consequences. He began reframing. He leaned into the idea that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He tried to make it about feelings instead of facts. He tried to make it about respect again. But police reports don't run on vibes. They run on timelines. Officer Shannon Price did what good officers do in messy public disputes. She separated the noise from the measurable. She kept asking the same kinds of questions: where everyone stood when the supposed contact happened, how it happened, what came before it, and what proof existed of any of it. Chase's answer kept landing in the same place. He didn't have proof of the arm grab, and the only video being shown didn't support his claim. And Janelle didn't try to win the conversation. She stayed in her lane. She kept her voice level. She kept space between herself and Chase. She let the record speak. That's the part a lot of people don't understand until they're in it. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. While Chase was detained, the store side of the story got even clearer. Devin Pike and shift manager Tina Alvarez weren't trying to take sides emotionally. They were doing something more useful than that. They were offering context and access. They explained to the officers that Janelle was a regular who didn't cause problems. Not perfect, not an angel, just consistent. The kind of customer who didn't bring drama into their store. That alone didn't prove innocence. But it mattered because it lowered the odds that she randomly snapped into violence at a pump. Then Tina made the next move that pushed the whole situation from a parking lot argument into a documented case. She initiated the process to get surveillance. Love's Locations didn't just hand footage out to anybody, and Tina knew it. She called for a manager and started the standard chain to access camera angles. The officers didn't treat it like overkill. They treated it like confirmation. Because if the cameras showed no physical contact, then this was bigger than a rude exchange. It was a false report with a named person and a serious allegation. And here's something people don't talk about enough. A false report doesn't just waste time. It puts a target on someone who didn't do anything. It invites escalation. It can become an arrest that never should have happened. That's why the tiny detail mattered so much. The distance on the phone video. If Janelle hadn't been recording, the officers would have been standing there with two competing stories and one person insisting he was attacked. In plenty of places, that's enough to make the wrong decision in the moment. Instead, the officers had a clip that froze reality. When Chase was taken into custody, it didn't look dramatic. It looked procedural. He was searched, handcuffed, and walked to the patrol vehicle. The energy at the pump dropped immediately once he was no longer controlling the scene with his voice. Janelle didn't celebrate. She didn't perform relief for anyone. She looked like someone who'd just dodged something she didn't want to think about. Officer Ramirez gave her contact information and instructions for sending over any additional recordings. He also explained what would likely happen next in the simplest terms, because the next part is where people get lost. Reports, evidence uploads, statements, follow-up calls, court dates if needed. Tina and Devin stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. It mattered that Janelle wasn't standing alone while paperwork got finished. It mattered that witnesses were willing to attach their names to what they'd observed, that she wasn't the problem customer, and that they were confident enough to push for camera footage. And meanwhile, Chase's original 911 call wasn't just floating in the air anymore. It became part of the case file. His words, how urgent he sounded, how sure he acted, how he described the alleged battery, were now evidence too. Back at the station, the pieces started lining up in a way Chase probably didn't anticipate. Officers had a false allegation of battery tied to a specific person, a phone video that contradicted the key claim, on-scene admission that he had no video proof, store employees willing to support the idea that the accused person wasn't creating problems, pending surveillance access that could further confirm or deny physical contact. That's not a messy he said, she said. That's a case with an obvious direction. And this is where viewers should ask themselves something. How many people have had the opposite outcome just because they didn't think to record? Over the next couple of days, the incident didn't disappear. Gas station staff talked. Regulars talked. People who weren't even there started hearing the story in pieces, first as gossip, then as a warning. But Janelle didn't run to social media immediately, even though Chase had tried to paint her like someone who would. She focused on the boring part, sending the videos to the officers, saving backups, and writing down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. Time, location, who said what, where everyone stood. That's what accountability actually looks like. Not a viral clip, a clean record. Chase, on the other hand, had a different kind of record being built around him now. His charge for making a false report wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant he'd have to answer for why he escalated a confrontation into a criminal accusation without proof. And once a prosecutor saw that phone video detail, the claim happening while the accused stood about 10 feet away, there was no way to pretend it was just confusion. The system doesn't always protect the right person, but when evidence is this clear, it becomes harder for anyone to ignore. And that's where the real consequences started. When Chase Whitaker's case hit court, he didn't look like the guy who demanded officers hurry. He looked like someone who'd finally realized that a 911 call didn't disappear just because the moment was over. The prosecutor didn't need a dramatic angle. The file already had a clean timeline. Chase had called police from the Loves on August 29, 2025, and reported a battery. He had identified Janelle Carter by outfit and car. He had described an arm grab as the reason for the call. Then, when officers arrived, Janelle had a phone recording that showed Chase repeating the allegation while she was clearly several steps away. Store employees had backed up that she was a regular who didn't cause trouble, and surveillance access had been initiated to confirm what the officers were already seeing. The physical contact claim didn't match reality. Chase tried to turn it into a story about disrespect and being embarrassed. He leaned on the argument that he felt threatened and reacted in the moment. But the court kept dragging it back to one point. He didn't report a feeling. He reported a specific act of violence. And when the judge looked at how the allegation was made, how it changed, and what the evidence showed, the case became about accountability for using the system as a weapon. The result wasn't a movie ending. It was the kind of ending that follows people quietly. Chase dealt with the consequences of being charged for a false report. The disorderly conduct and obstruction issues followed him too, tied to how he behaved during the response once officers started checking his story instead of accepting it. Court costs, penalties, and a case record were the kind of consequences that didn't go viral, but absolutely changed what future paperwork and background checks would look like. While Chase tried to manage fallout, Janelle did something that mattered more than arguing with anyone afterward. She treated the whole thing like a lesson in preserving proof. She submitted every video clip she had in full, with original timestamps intact. She saved backups in more than one place. She requested the incident report through the proper process and kept the confirmation trail. She wrote down the names connected to the case: Officer Luis Ramirez, Officer Shannon Price, Sergeant Dane Holt, plus the Love's staff who stepped up: Tina Alvarez and Devin Pike. Not to build a social media moment, to build a record. She also contacted Love's corporate customer relations, not to blame the store, but to make sure the location's cooperation and surveillance process were documented from the business side too. That move mattered because companies pay attention when an incident shows they could be pulled into liability or public scrutiny later. Love's didn't dismiss her. The store staff had done the right thing. They stayed neutral, offered surveillance access, and helped stabilize the situation by backing facts instead of drama. Inside that Love's after August 29th, the atmosphere shifted in small ways. Employees got quicker about pulling a manager in when someone started trying to control another customer. They stopped brushing off early warning signs like aggressive commands, following too close, and escalating a petty argument into a police-level accusation. Tina made sure staff understood the difference between a loud customer and a customer trying to use authority as a threat. Janelle didn't walk away thinking the world had suddenly become fair. She walked away knowing one ugly truth and one useful truth. The ugly truth was that she could do everything right and still be accused. The useful truth was that documentation could keep an accusation from turning into handcuffs. That night could have ended differently if one tiny detail hadn't been there. Video showing distance, clearly enough that nobody could pretend it was a mystery. So here's what this story really teaches. When someone tries to turn a personal confrontation into a police problem, staying calm is only half the battle. The other half is preserving the truth in a way the system can't ignore. Now let me ask you, if you were in Janelle's position, would you have started recording right away? Or would you have assumed the truth would speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more story times where receipts beat loud accusations and accountability actually shows up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.
So it's clear.
I'm recording because you walked up recording us.
What are you taking pictures of? Why are you here?
We're filming in public. You don't need our personal details.
Michigan plates. That tells me everything. You're not from here.
So because we're black and not from here, you're treating us like suspects?
Yes. I'm racist.
Jalen saw it in the man's hands first, phone up, already recording, before he even heard the footsteps. Old Town was still waking up. Stores were dark. Streets were quiet. And yet this 72-year-old white man walked straight toward two black men with a camera, like he'd been waiting for a reason. He didn't start with a greeting. He started like an interrogation. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you watch stories about people getting exposed when they try to play neighborhood police, hit like and subscribe, because this one turns ugly fast, and then it turns expensive. Now, rewind, because the setup matters. It was early morning in Old Town Scottsdale, the kind of place that sells a safe image, like it's part of the sidewalk. Everything looks controlled. Everything looks curated. And that's exactly why what happened next felt so calculated. Jalen and Dominic were there to film. They weren't yelling. They weren't blocking anybody. They weren't breaking rules. Just two black men working with professional gear, catching clean morning shots while the streets were empty. Then Paul showed up. Paul didn't come over like a curious local. He came over like he'd already made a call in his head. He started recording them immediately and pressed them with questions about what they were photographing and why they were there. The way he asked wasn't curiosity, it was accusation. Like the camera itself was suspicious and the people holding it had to prove they had a right to stand on that sidewalk. Jalen and Dominic didn't feed it. They stayed calm and made it clear they weren't obligated to answer. They kept their own camera up too, because the first rule of situations like this is simple. If someone is recording you like a suspect, you record them back like evidence. That's when Paul changed angles. He stopped focusing on the filming and started digging into identity. He pressed for where they lived. He pushed for personal details. He tried to turn the conversation into a background check. And then he found what he thought was his winning card. Their car had Michigan plates. Paul pointed it out like he'd just solved a case. The out-of-state plate became his proof that they didn't belong, that this wasn't normal, that this was something he needed to confront. This part is important because it's a common move. If you can't openly say you don't want certain people in your space, you pick something else, plates, clothes, time of day, and act like you're just being careful. But Jalen didn't let him hide behind that. He called out what it felt like, racial suspicion dressed up as neighborhood concern. And here's the moment everything shifted. Paul didn't deny it. He didn't correct it. He didn't do the usual scramble. No, I treat everyone the same. No, you're misunderstanding me. No, I'm just looking out. Paul said he was racist, out loud, like it was a badge he'd earned. Then he tried to justify it by talking about the area like it was some restricted zone, like a no zone, as if he had authority to decide who gets to exist there without being questioned. That's the mask-off moment. Because once someone admits that, the confrontation isn't about cameras anymore. It's about power. It's about intimidation. It's about what he thinks he can get away with. And Paul acted like he could get away with a lot. He stepped closer. He crowded them. He kept his phone trained on them while pushing into their space like he wanted them uncomfortable enough to leave on their own. When Jalen and Dominic held their ground, Paul tried control through tone. He talked like they weren't allowed to respond. Like any pushback was talking back. Like he was disciplining them instead of speaking to equals. And when even that didn't work, when they still didn't leave, still didn't shrink, still kept recording, Paul escalated again. He started threatening force, not hypothetical, not joking. The kind of lines meant to make two men decide whether to risk a fight or walk away. Jalen and Dominic didn't mirror him. They didn't step into his chaos. They did something smarter. They went firm and procedural. They told him to back up. They told him to stop crowding them. They made it clear they felt threatened. They warned him not to touch them. And in that quiet early morning street, with fewer people around and less accountability in the moment, those cameras became the only thing keeping this from turning into Paul's private version of justice. Because here's what Paul didn't expect. They weren't leaving, and they weren't going to let him rewrite the story later. They were building a record in real time. And Paul, still recording, still pressing, still acting like he ran the sidewalk, was about to say and do the exact things that would follow him for the rest of his life. By lunchtime, the clip wasn't just a weird morning anymore. It was everywhere. People weren't arguing about what happened. They were arguing about what it meant. And that's because the video didn't leave room for interpretation. It showed an older man walking up like he owned the sidewalk, recording two black men like suspects, and escalating when they refused to submit. Old Town Scottsdale is the kind of place where reputation matters. Businesses depend on the image. And once that video started picking up traction, it stopped being a personal confrontation and became a public problem. That's why the police reached out the same day. Not because Jalen and Dominic did anything wrong, because they didn't, but because the internet had already done what it always does. It forced the situation into the light. When officers contacted Paul, they didn't come at him like he was a criminal right away. They did what police do when they're trying to pin down the facts. They asked what led to the encounter. Paul's response told them everything. He didn't describe it as a neighbor moment. He described it like a security incident. He said he saw two black men with a sophisticated camera and decided it didn't look like tourism. He framed their presence like it was suspicious by default, like the burden was on them to prove they weren't a threat. Then he reached for his justification. He claimed he was watching for trouble because of protests and unrest. Like that turned his assumptions into responsibility. And here's where it gets even more revealing. Paul admitted he took a picture of them first. Not a casual photo, not a harmless snapshot. He presented it like documentation, like he was collecting intelligence. He said they took exception, as if their reaction was the problem instead of his behavior. Then he told the officers what he did next. He forwarded the photo to a nearby shop owner. That's an escalation a lot of people miss in the moment, because it sounds small until you think about it. That wasn't just being nosy. That was trying to build a little neighborhood network, trying to turn a stranger's suspicion into a community warning. And Paul wasn't done. He told police he went back to get a clearer picture of the license plate. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because a crime happened. Because in his words, he believed they looked like a recon team. That phrase matters. Recon team isn't a normal word for tourists. It's a word that turns two people with a camera into an enemy unit. It's how someone justifies treating a sidewalk like a checkpoint. And while he was saying all this to police, he spoke like it would all make sense if people just listened long enough. But the officers weren't there to agree with him. They were there to document his choices. And they could hear what he couldn't. The way he described two black guys wasn't neutral. It wasn't a detail. It was the foundation of his suspicion. He didn't say, "I saw two people with a camera." He led with race, then added the gear, then added a story about unrest, then landed on the conclusion, threat. That's the chess game. You stack reasonable sounding pieces until the bias looks like logic. But the video existed. The internet had it. And now the police had Paul on record explaining his thinking in his own words. And that's why what happened next didn't stay dead by next Tuesday. Because the next day, officers came back. Not to chat. To confront him with the reality he kept dodging. His behavior wasn't just offensive. It was provocative enough to start a physical fight. They challenge him directly. Ask him to imagine being on the receiving end of it. And Paul does what people like him often do when they realize the room has changed. He tries to minimize. He tries to shrug it off. And then, because the city has the video, his statements, and the escalation, everything flips. The next day, police didn't call Paul to check in. They showed up. Because once something like that goes viral, it stops being a he said. It becomes a public record. And Scottsdale PD had two problems on their hands: the incident itself and the fact that Paul looked comfortable doing it. When officers spoke to him again, they weren't interested in his theories about cameras or recon. They focused on what actually creates danger in the real world. The way he approached, the way he escalated, and the way his words could have triggered a fight in the middle of Old Town. They pressed him on the obvious point. His comments weren't just rude, they were provocative. A stranger walks up recording, interrogates people, crowds them, then starts talking like he's ready to put someone on the ground. That's how people get hurt. Paul didn't meet them where they were. He minimized. He framed it like a misunderstanding that would fade out on its own, acting like the internet was dramatic, and the whole thing would be forgotten in days. He talked like this was a temporary inconvenience, not a serious escalation that he started. The officers didn't treat it like a temporary inconvenience. They challenged him to imagine being on the receiving end. Two men minding their business, getting filmed and interrogated, then threatened. They made it clear that what he did wasn't neighborhood watch. It was confrontation. Paul still acted like it wasn't that big, so they made it big. They placed him under arrest for disorderly conduct. And that's when Paul's confidence finally cracked. Not into remorse, but into surprise. He didn't expect the system he'd been leaning on culturally to turn and face him. During the arrest process, officers did what they always do. They asked about weapons. Paul admitted he had them. He said yes without hesitation, like it was normal, like it was just how life worked. And he tried to frame it that way, like carrying was standard, like it shouldn't matter. But it mattered. Because now the situation had a sharper edge. This wasn't just an older man running his mouth. This was an older man threatening physical force, while also being armed. And that explained the tiny detail that changed everything. Jalen and Dominic had cameras up. They didn't rely on someone else to tell their story later. They didn't assume people would be fair. They documented it in real time. Without that Paul's version, suspicious guys, sophisticated camera, recon, I was being careful, could have been the only narrative that mattered. But with video, the narrative couldn't be rewritten. After the arrest, the consequences moved fast. Paul wasn't just facing a charge and an embarrassed moment. His professional life got pulled into it too. His real estate agency cut ties with him and recommended his license be revoked. They didn't treat it like personal opinions. They treated it like conduct that reflected back on them. And on the other side, one of the men made it clear he didn't want a quiet apology or a slap on the wrist. He wanted the case pushed as far as possible, not out of revenge, but to set a public boundary. You can't confront people like that, threaten them, and then act like it's normal. The story had started on a calm, old town sidewalk. It ended with an arrest, a charge, and a man learning that neighborhood authority doesn't mean anything when the evidence is clear. The arrest didn't end the story. It stabilized it. Because the moment Paul was taken in, the conversation online shifted from outrage to receipts. People stopped asking what happened and started tracking what consequences looked like in real life. The video kept circulating, but now it was paired with the details everyone had been waiting for. Police had contacted Paul the same day, challenged him the next, and then arrested him for disorderly conduct. That timeline mattered. It showed the system didn't just watch the internet argue, it acted. In Scottsdale, word traveled the way it always does. Faster than officials, faster than statements. Old Town business owners saw it. Regulars saw it. People who recognized the street corners saw it. And a lot of them understood the quiet part. If this could happen to two men holding a camera in broad daylight, it could happen to anybody who looked wrong to the wrong person. The shop owner Paul had messaged got pulled into the story too, whether they wanted to or not. Because Paul had described to police that he'd sent a photo over, like it was a neighborhood warning. That meant he wasn't just confronting strangers. He was trying to recruit other people into his suspicion, to normalize the idea that filming while black in Old Town needed to be monitored. But the biggest pressure point hit Paul where he didn't expect it. His job. The internet is loud, but employers move quietly and quickly when their brand is on the line. Paul's real estate agency didn't frame it as two sides. They didn't treat it like a misunderstanding. They cut ties with him and recommended action against his license. That decision told the public something important. This wasn't just opinions. This was behavior. The kind that could cost clients, endanger coworkers, and drag the company into lawsuits and headlines. Meanwhile, Jalen and Dominic were still dealing with the part people rarely talk about, the aftershock. Even when you win the moment by staying calm and recording, your body remembers the threat, the crowding, the intimidation, the fact that a stranger felt comfortable telling you he could put you on the ground in an empty street. They didn't try to turn it into a performance. They kept it practical. One of them went public with a clear goal. He wanted the case prosecuted as far as possible, not because he thought punishment fixes everything, but because a public example sets a boundary. It tells the next person thinking of doing this that the outcome isn't a viral clip and a shrug. It's handcuffs, a record, and fallout. And that was the real shift. Paul had tried to control the story from the first second by recording them first, labeling them outsiders, and treating their presence like a threat. But once the footage spread, he lost control of what mattered most: how the public saw it, how police documented it, and how institutions responded to it. Old Town went back to looking calm. Same sidewalks, same morning light. But now everyone knew what safe had meant to Paul, and what it could cost when someone like him decided to act on it. A week later, Old Town Scottsdale looked the same. Morning walkers still moved through the same streets. Tourists still took selfies by the same corners. Cameras still pointed at murals, storefronts, sunlit sidewalks. But Jalen and Dominic weren't looking at the neighborhood the same way anymore. Because the lesson wasn't that one rude man got arrested. The lesson was how fast a normal moment can turn into a confrontation when someone decides they have the right to police you. Paul never needed a uniform to act like an officer. He didn't need permission to interrogate strangers. He didn't need proof to assume the worst. All he needed was confidence, an audience he thought would side with him, and a story he could tell himself, that he was protecting something. That's the trick in a lot of these situations. The person escalating doesn't see it as escalation. They see it as duty. And that's why the tiny detail mattered. The reason this didn't end worse was simple. The cameras were already rolling. And Jalen and Dominic didn't surrender control of the narrative. They didn't get baited into swinging first. They didn't get baited into saying something they'd regret. They stayed calm, stayed firm, and kept repeating the only boundary that matters in a situation like that: back up, don't touch, stop crowding. Then they let the evidence do the heavy lifting. Because once the video hit the internet, Paul's favorite weapon, his confidence, turned into his biggest liability. His words didn't sound like concern. They sounded like what they were: suspicion aimed at two black men for existing in the wrong place with the wrong look, plus threats meant to force them to leave. And when police got involved, Paul's own explanation didn't help him. He doubled down. He described them by race first. He framed their equipment like it was criminal. He called them a recon team. He admitted he tried to gather identifying details. He treated a public sidewalk like a controlled zone. Even after officers challenged him on how provocative he'd been, he still talked like it would blow over. It didn't. He got arrested for disorderly conduct. He admitted he had weapons. His agency fired him and pushed for his license to be revoked. And the men he confronted made it clear they wanted prosecution taken as far as possible, because the point wasn't just punishment, it was precedent. And accountability doesn't always come from someone doing the right thing in the moment. Sometimes it comes from the public seeing the truth clearly enough that institutions can't ignore it. Now let me ask you something. If you were Jalen or Dominic, would you have stayed and kept filming? Or would you have left the second a stranger started interrogating you? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you've ever been put in a situation